Oil slicked his fingers, and the danfo outside honked like a bad mood when the pregnant woman hissed, "Tunde, hurry!" because the bus wouldn't start, and the rain had turned the red earth to a thick, sticky soup that would swallow time and lives if they waited. If the engine wouldn't turn and the clinic was across town, who would answer for a newborn's life if the motor failed? Why did every person on that crowded roadside laugh at the folds of his shirt and the holes in his shoes when he bent over the carburetor, and who would believe him if he said he had more money than the man in the black SUV watching from the shade? He felt the sting of every mocking glance like salt on a fresh cut, and all he could do was pray his hands could pull this family back from disaster, until the man in the SUV stepped forward and said, "He looks like a mechanic, but is he?" The question landed like thunder, and the crowd turned to watch him with a new, puzzled hunger. Tunde had known the sting of mockery since he was a boy at Mosen Market, and he had built his life on tools, honesty, and the steady hum of generators at night. He had a mother who cooked plain rice and pepper soup with the patience of saints, and a little sister who stitched old shirts into children's dresses to sell. They called him Tunde the Mechanic, and sometimes Olowo, in jest, rich, 'cause the rumor had always been that the Owolabi name once bought whole streets of Lagos, though in his pocket there were only coins and the promise to send his sister to night school. He had an ordinary world of grime and small mercies, danfo horns at dawn, the metallic clang of the workshop gate, Harmattan breath rubbing dust into his eyelashes, and the way the red earth smelled after rain. That was home, and it taught him what mattered. They mocked the mechanic's clothes, and he wore the mockery like iron armor, because a man who could fix engines could also fix the small ruptures of dignity around him, or so he told himself each night when he slept on a cot behind the workshop. The normal cracked the morning the counselor's convoy rolled up, and Reverend Bello, soft hands, softer smile, offered a contract to fix 3 Harambee buses for the new community shuttle program, saying, "We want the best, and I hear you're the best, Tunde." Felt the possibility like sunlight and imagined paying the hospital bill for his mother, maybe even the school fees for his sister. It should have been a closing of a long road. Instead, Tunde's hope was trampled the same week when a toolkit vanished and someone accused him of theft, a betrayal with fingerprints on his reputation. He stood before the council office, hands smelling of grease, hearing the word guilty, as if the street itself had declared it, and wondered who could slit someone's name and leave the blood on the pavement. The first trial was money. With the promised counselor work pulled and the community shuttle given to a slick garage uptown, Tunde watched rich men in polished shoes stride past his gate as if his place did not exist, feeling the grind of poverty like sand in his lungs. He had to choose between pawning the only good wrench set or letting his sister stop school, and the choice bit him for weeks. When he closed the shop early, he could see the black SUV return again and again, watching how he served poor women for free, and how he refused to cheat even when he could. The second trial came when the Reverend, who had once clasped his shoulder and said, "God will lift you," asked him for a donation to the church roof, then used the occasion for a sermon that lifted other names and not his, making Tunde the face of industrious humility while pocketing the cash. He felt the Reverend's hand like a weight on his back and wondered how a shepherd could let wolves in his flock. Who exactly was the shepherd, and who the wolf? A week later, the third trial arrived with a smear posted at midnight by a woman who smiled in the marketplace and always asked about his mother's health. She called herself Amaka and said, "I'm helping you get credit," while taking pictures of his ledger and then selling that trust to the man who wanted to take his yard for redevelopment. The toolkit accusation resurfaced with fake receipts and a video of him stealing parts that played in the mall and at the tea stalls, and the city that had once nodded now shook its head as if his mistakes were a contagious fever. Every client who could afford the new garage drove their SUV past and pretended not to see the little yard of Tunde's name on the gate, and he could feel his life narrowing like a drum under a fist. The crowd's laughter from that roadside the other day turned into whispers that followed him like an animal in heat. What would he do when whispers were louder than truth? Night to walk past the market under Harmattan skies, watching the candles in small shops and the generator humming outside the clinic, while the red earth cooled and the smell of fried plantain drifted from a distant stall. There, by an old mosque courtyard, a boy dropped his shoes and cried because his mother had no money for medicine. Sat down and mended the boy's torn sandal with a scrap of leather and a stitch, feeling the familiar pull of mercy. An elegantly dressed woman, who had been sitting in the black SUV's shade earlier that week, stopped and watched without comment as he worked, then slipped a card into the prayer leaflets. "For the mechanic," the card read, with an emblem of a law firm. It was a gentle act she could have ignored, but she had seen something in his face and the way he treated a child's pain as if it were his own, and that observation would wind like a thread back through the story later. For now, Tunde only felt gratitude and a tightening urgency. By the third day, the landlord's letter was a blade. Pay by dawn, or the workshop would be locked and auctioned, and his mother's medicine would be cut off if he didn't find 3,000 naira to cover the clinic's demand. He had 3 days to raise the money, and the city's pulse felt like a timer pressing on his chest as danfo horns collided with traffic and a generator kept the compound alive through the night. He tried to borrow from old customers, scraped a little from the repair bills left unpaid, and even walked to the mosque courtyard hoping a prayer might do what coins would not. Each plan creaked under the weight of a city that had little patience for slow miracles. He could imagine 2 choices: confess his hidden past to get help and risk humiliating his mother, or continue to wear the mechanic's clothes and scrape, and both options tightened the noose of shame around him. One evening, when the Harmattan had turned the air to thin paper and the market bustle had quieted to a long exhale, Tunde fixed a church generator that had been silent since Sunday and refused any payment, saying, "Keep the money for the old women who come for soup." Left before the choir rose to test the lights, but the church treasurer, Uche, stood at the gate with a face lined like a well-worn palm, and did not forget. Uche had been the pallbearer at the funeral of a man who once owned half of this part of Lagos, and the name Owolabi sat like a bruise under his memory. Tunde did not know that Uche would later rummage through papers in an old office and find the thread that could either tie his past to his present or cut him off entirely. For now, Tunde simply felt the warmth of having stepped toward people he loved rather than toward the money that could silence them. Time compressed further. The landlord returned 2 days before dawn, and the clinic called to say his mother's surgery could not be scheduled without deposit. "You have 48 hours, they said, and in nights that followed, Tunde ran like someone who knew that a single missed breath could end a life. The smear campaign had spread to the local online pages, and the man with the sly smile at the council office demanded his workshop keys in the name of redevelopment, pawing at opportunities with the greed of a man who had already decided the city was his to carve. They had to enter a citywide mechanic showcase, an unlikely place to find salvation, because the first prize was enough to cover his debts and the paperwork to stop the auction. He had 3 days to build a prototype that would impress judges who wore cufflinks and spoke of margins. He felt the deadline like a drumbeat in his chest, and the engine oil on his hands like a second pulse. Halfway mark, under the sudden glare of studio lights and a camera crew eager for scandal, a figure from his past stepped onto the stage and removed a hat as if to reveal more than a face. The law firm's card that had been slipped into the church leaflets belonged to Mariam Olovu, his sister, who was now the CEO of a logistics company and who had been searching for him for years. "My brother," she said into microphones as the murmur swelled, "is not the man they paint on the internet." The audience leaned forward, and the smear videos stuttered into irrelevance as documents unfolded. His father's will, filed but hidden, shares left in trust, a name kept quiet so he could be free. The revelation reframed everything. He had not been merely a poor mechanic scraping to survive. He had been a man who chose the street over a boardroom and now stood at a crossroads where choice and inheritance collided. Tunde felt the air change. The phones clicked. Danfo horns outside seemed to mute as people waited for what he would do with the power now placed before him. In the hush that followed the reveal, everything seemed to turn dark in its own way. The wolf, Counselor Adeyemi, moved like a shadow, and the reverend who had preached charity now spoke of mismanagement with an easy voice. The men who had mocked him sharpened their eyes at the papers like vultures. Tunde sat under the stage lights and understood that the reveal could become a weapon or a healing balm, and that the world would not let a man be humble without making a spectacle of it. His sister offered him the keys to an account, to hospitals, to lawyers, but also warned, "They will want what you have, not who you are." Tunde's darkest moment was not the hunger or the shame. It was the choice he faced, to use the money for revenge or to use it to protect the small, tender mercies he had always kept. He felt his father's old voice in the back of his throat and chose the latter. When the counselor tried to seize the workshop that afternoon, bolstered by forged documents and the reverend's sermon as a moral scaffold, Tunde stood before a crowd of neighbors and said, "It was here I learned to fix what's broken. We will not be sold." The media had come because of the earlier reveal, and cameras caught the moment when Tunde signed papers that nullified the counselor's claims, not to ruin him, but to recover the community land and turn it into a vocational center where apprentices could learn mechanics, electricity, and bookkeeping. The wolf in sheep's clothing was exposed. Reverend Bello's sermons lost their flock when receipts were produced. Counselor Adeyemi's redevelopment scheme unraveled when Uche, the church treasurer, handed over old bank transfers that showed kickbacks. The men who had thought wealth was an instrument to cut others had their instruments taken away. The consequence was legal, public, and irreversible, and the city watched as the weak claimants of power were humbled under the law's clear rhythm. Justice landed with visible beats, a court case, a signed settlement, the counselor's name in the newspaper beside the word embezzlement, and Reverend Bello quietly absent from his own pulpit as investigations began. Tunde used part of the money not to build a mansion, but to set up a payment plan for his mother's care, to buy back the tools people had pawned because of earlier rumors, and to lease the workshop officially so no one could ever close it again. He hired apprentices, men and women who had once laughed at him, now looking at him with something like hope rather than scorn, and the vocational center opened with the din of generators, the smell of cooking oil from nearby small stalls, and the honk of danfos that had always been the soundtrack of these streets. The black SUV remained an occasional presence, but now it came with deliveries of parts and boxes of notebooks for the evening classes. The wealth gap had not vanished, but the billionaire in him had chosen to stitch a bridge across it. The new normal settled into the city like a slow, deliberate prayer. His mother's windows were cleaned and her medicine arrived on time. His sister had a seat on the board of the new vocational trust, and the old church's generator hummed every Sunday. Tunde still wore patched shirts some days because he liked them, because his hands smelled of oil and that smell told him who he was. But the laughter no longer had the sting of powerlessness. Neighbors who had once sneered now came with stories of their children's jobs and the small miracles of steady pay. He watched a young apprentice, with fingers as sure as his once were, tighten a bolt on a bus, and felt the satisfaction of a man who had chosen to convert hidden wealth into visible work. "We will teach them to fix cars and to mend lives," he told the gathered crowd, and the words landed like the first notes of a Yemen. The contrast was sharp. No gilded gate, no isolated mansion. Instead, a workshop that taught, a clinic with funded beds, and meals that were full more often than not. Kindness, he learned, had been the seed that rooted everything. The day he had mended a child's sandal, the night he refused payment for generator repairs, the morning he handed his sister the little money he'd scraped together. Those acts had not been investments in bank ledgers, but in human soil that later held his life together. He had been mocked and called names, and the secret of his birthright had been both a shield and a temptation. But he chose to turn inheritance into opportunity, not into a tower that looked down on the people who raised him. The why was simple to him now. Wealth without work shared is loneliness in a polished suit. Truth, even slow, has the stubbornness of a mango tree in breeze. The reaction from the neighborhood was not immediate applause, but steady rebuilding, legal papers recorded, jobs advertised, and a community that could point to kitchens with warm soup and say, "We survived." Do not judge a soul by the cloth it wears. Kindness is currency that grows when spent, and truth will find the road even when it is paved with stones. Wealth can be a ladder or a wall, and the choice to climb with others is the difference between a lonely mansion and a place where people come through the gate with open hands. In the end, the mechanic's clothes were only a chapter, and a man's character wrote the rest. If this tale touched you, tell me which part felt most true to your neighborhood. Leave a comment below, and if you want more stories like this one, please subscribe, like, and share. Turn on notifications so the next story arrives in your feed like a friend knocking at the door. In that hush, Mariam Olowu stepped from the side's shade into the glow of the studio lights, and when she spoke, her voice carried the slow certainty of someone who has watched a city learn to breathe again. Tunde, we are not here to gloat. We are here to build. As the crowd leaned in, the air thickened with questions, and the scent of fried plantain from the market drifted through the doors. She swept aside the rumor cloud with a ledger full of numbers and a promise that could heal the months of hunger. A fully funded Tunde Owolabi Vocational Foundation, a bank of future hands, and the hospital deposits paid not by begging, but by a river of inherited wealth now turned to community capital. The old workshop would be registered officially as the hub of training for mechanics, electricians, and small business bookkeeping, a beacon to show that hidden wealth need not puff up a man but lift a quarter of the city. She revealed the family's will, the sealed shares, the quiet trust tucked behind a legal coat of arms, and with every word the room exhaled like a crowd exhaling after a storm. The sting of past betrayals softened into a cautious hope, and the muffled laughter that had followed him into the night seemed to turn toward him, the man who had fixed more than engines, who had repaired dignity with bare hands, and now stood at the door of a new kind of wealth that asked for patience as much as for coins. The interval's twist did more than unveil money. It re-scripted purpose. If the city could be saved by a bench of apprentices and a man who wore his patchwork past like armor, then the old accusations, the stolen toolkit, the forged receipts, the whispered joke of a Wolo rich, could be weighed against the evidence of work that fed mothers, taught daughters, and steadied neighbors who once slid toward despair. The crowd's breath shifted, the danfo horns hissed in. The distance and even the generator's hum settled into a steadier, almost reverent rhythm, as if the city itself were listening for the right note to begin with. Yet the moment held a sharper edge than relief, because Mariam's eyes, a mirror of the long corridors where boardroom deals were born, flicked toward the men who had thrived on ruining him, and she asked, not loudly but with an authority that could be heard in the back row of the market, whether they were prepared to answer for what they had done, whether justice would ride with him or overtake him, and whether a sister's silent years of planning could outpace a city's hunger for spectacle. The point delivered a deeper reckoning. A thin folder slipped from Mariam's purse, bore the old family seal and the names of people who had stood in the shadow of a wealth they believed was only rumor, and in it lay a map of his true inheritance, lands, shares, and a legal labyrinth that, if untangled, would free the workshop from every lien and every rumor. A lawyer from Mariam's firm stepped forward, her heels clicking like courthouse clocks, and read aloud a clause that named Tunde as a principal beneficiary and trustee of a local redevelopment fund intended to divert capital from speculative schemes to real, usable capital for the people who had kept the city alive through rains and blackouts. The revelation landed like a thunderclap that did not strike him down, but raised him up, and the crowd who had mocked him now murmured with a new respect that tasted of soil and rain rather than oil and ego. It was not merely a windfall, it was a second birth, an inheritance reimagined as civic trust, and as the documents passed from hand to hand, the old landlord's threats, the online smear campaigns, and even the reverend's sermon masquerading as mercy dissolved against the ink's cold truth, that wealth, wielded with transparency, could become shelter rather than sword, a city's ladder rather than a wall. The turning point sharpened when Tunde rose to insist that the funds be used to restore the clinic's medicines and to pay the old women who queued for soup, then invest in the apprentices' stipends and in a legal shield that would prevent any future landlord from ever threatening to shut them down again. The applause that followed was not loud so much as steady, a soft clap that warmed rather than burned, a sign that a people could cheer for a public good without sacrificing their own dignity. And the sister's quiet nod told him that this plan, this bridge across the wealth gap, would hold not because money was suddenly available, but because trust had finally become accountable. As cameras clicked and the room settled into a hush, Mariam turned to the crowd and spoke of governance, of a transparent advisory board that would include 2 young women from the market and a former bus driver who now ran the Helpers Union, so that every dollar would be watched by those who would be most affected by how it moved. The board's first act would be to sign off on the foundation's charter, launch a scholarship fund for girls who wanted to study auto mechanics, and commission a fleet of refurbished buses that would run on clean energy while teaching the next generation how to maintain them. An image of a city reimagined as practical, stubbornly hopeful, and fair. In the wake of the reveal, the antagonist paid a price that felt like a peeling away of masks. The counselor Adeyemi's development project evaporated under a cascade of audit reports and a public call for accountability. Reverend Bellows' carefully curated charity became a case study in misplaced trust as his sermons were replayed beside receipts and canceled checks, the crowd's whispers turning to a chorus of judgment that echoed through the market lanes and into the shining glass offices where deals had once been made with a handshake and a wink. Amaka's online help had stood on a thin stool of leverage, but the ledger's truth toppled her held-up narrative as the city's lawyers filed counterclaims and the local press published her name with a cautionary note about fraud. And suddenly, the street where Tunde once fixed sandals and free gen-set repairs became a ledger of justice, a place where the poor were not asked to bargain their dignity in exchange for a loan, but given steps toward ownership of their own futures. Yet even as the walls came down, a last test remained, the SUV that had lingered in their periphery, the one that watched with the calm interest of someone counting the clock. It did not roar away in triumph, but rolled closer, and from its tinted window a man descended, not in a showy suit but in work boots and a folded newspaper, the kind of figure who could be mistaken for a neighbor or a judge. And he flashed a business card that bore the new foundation's logo and a line that read, "Strategic Benefactor," before slipping back into the crowd and vanishing, leaving only the sense that the city's new wealth was not a single actor, but a chorus of hands and eyes and plans that would hold him to the fire of accountability as long as he stayed in sight. Days later, 2 weeks and a bus ride away from the studio, the proof of change arrived in quiet, concrete form. The clinic's shelves filled with medicine once delayed by debt. The schoolyard behind the workshop hosting evening classes where women learned wiring and men learned budgeting. And the first cohort of apprentices, both boys and girls, stepping into the workshop doors with bright shoes and nervous smiles, watched over by mentors who had traveled through the same fear and who now walked beside them as living proof that mercy could be a curriculum as rigorous as math. The old landlord, who had barked threats, now stood with a smile tempered by respect as he watched a building funded by the new foundation begin to glow with fresh paint and new windows. The community's mood shifted from wary pride to sturdy hope, every victory measured in new jobs, in mothers who could buy medicine on time, in youths who could dream of owning a bus company someday, in a neighborhood where the smell of generator oil no longer signified only scarcity, but the fuel for shared ascent. The interval's film had restarted with an act of benevolence that did not erase the fracture of the past, but stitched it with a stronger thread. The truth that wealth is a responsibility borrowed from a history of hardship and repaid to a future that belongs to all who came up through the red earth's rain and the market's noise. As Tunde stood at the workshop gate with a wrench in one hand and a child's chalk drawing in the other, he spoke softly to the crowd that gathered, neighbors, apprentices, old customers, the curious, and said, "Kindness is currency that grows when spent. Wealth must travel through doors, not through walls." And the smile on his face, shared with Miriam, told him the interval had become a new opening, a scene where the gates of justice, opportunity, and dignity were finally open, and the next shot, the next act, would begin with the first class filed into the shed's bright morning light, a choir of voices promising to mend not only engines, but lives, and one last, quiet signal as the SUV that had watched all along rolled away, its engines soft as a memory, leaving behind a future that now belonged to them all. The interval's hush had barely faded when the dawn light found its way to the shed, and Mariam's words echoed through the yard like a bell. "Today we plant a foundation. Today we choose to be accountable. Today the city learns to measure wealth by what it builds for others, not by the size of its gates." Tunde stood with a wrench in one hand and a chalk-dusted notebook in the other as a line of apprentices filed in, heads bobbing with nerves and hope, while a chorus of market voices rose outside the fence and the generator hummed low, promising that the night's hunger would be fed by work more than by worry. A small boy leaned on a stool and whispered, "Will we be paid fairly, sir?" And Tunde answered with a nod, and for once a voice that carried beyond the yard, "We work because we belong here." In that moment, every crack in the old wall seemed to breathe, as if the bricks remembered the rain and the danfo horns and the women who had loaned their cups of soup to strangers, and the city itself looked on as if it had finally learned the language of upbuilding rather than counting losses, even as the SUV's shadow lingered at the far end of the street, the observer who had watched him through all the trials, now almost a rumor. The crowd jostled closer when Miriam stepped to the makeshift podium, a folded charter in her hand, and spoke again not as a sister or a shareholder, but as a steward of collective futures. "This is not charity. It is governance with mercy." A murmur rolled through the group, and then a younger apprentice raised his voice, asking how the first stipends would be funded. Miriam answered with a plan that tasted like rain after a long drought. Funds pooled through the foundation, matched by a citywide micro-loan system and a transparent ledger that would be posted weekly on a wall where everyone could read it, the numbers moving like beads on a string toward a shared necklace of progress. Tunde's heart rode the words, and for the first time in months, he felt the tight knot of fear loosen just enough for him to exhale without coughing up pride or shame. The engine of the day grew louder as the first contracts were drafted on salvaged panels, and the apprentices crowded around the whiteboard where a map showed every bay, every bench's rule for safety. The first class would learn not only how to fix engines, but how to read a balance sheet, how to bid for parts honestly, how to manage a small cooperative. The room's air thickened with the scent of coffee and warm oil, and the soft, almost shy smiles of people who had learned to measure worth in small mercies rather than loud triumphs. But the day's light also pulled a thread from the shadows. A courier arrived with a sealed envelope bearing the foundation's crest and a crisp white sheet inside that listed the first donor circle. A few business owners, a nurse, a retiree who remembered how it felt to be told you mattered, and a note that read, "From someone who knows what it costs to be counted." The crowd pressed in, wondering who among the city's unseen patrons would step forward to shoulder the risk of reform without the spectacle of a hero's parade. The note's ambiguity sharpened the moment's tension, yet Tunde kept his footing, reminding himself aloud to the group, "We fix engines, and we fix lives with the same hands." The noise from outside swelled, vendors calling, a child's laughter, a vendor's drumbeat, and for a heartbeat the old smear's ghosts tried to creep in. But Miriam raised her palm, and the voices stilled, a sign that the city, once quick to whisper about betrayal, was learning to whisper about rebuilding with patience and accountability. Midway through the day, the turning point came not with a roar, but with a document that landed on the table in Miriam's steady handwriting. The local council's papers had not only acknowledged the foundation, but had agreed to synchronize redevelopment funds with actual training opportunities, so that every new road or market stall project would come with a paid apprenticeship and a repair workshop attached to it, a concrete bargain that made the rumor of wealth bend toward usefulness. The crowd's eyes shifted toward Tunde, and in his chest, the old ache of being watched by those who had once dismissed him flared into a stubborn flame. If his legacy could be rewritten in this way, then perhaps the chain of humiliation that had followed his family since his father's era could finally be broken, not by a sudden gift, but by a steady, public demonstration that honesty and labor create more durable riches than easy gossip and quick money. And just as the sun reached its midday peak, a quiet alarm sounded in the yard. Someone had kept a ledger from the night of the gallery's smear, and the page turned up a second name, a cautionary note that Amaka's posturing of help had concealed a hidden set of transfers, a reminder that when wealth travels through channels unseen, the city's memory can still be used as a weapon. Tunde pressed his lips together and looked toward the new charter and the smiling apprentices, wondering who else might be watching with a different motive. And the moment's fear tightened its claws again until Miriam stepped between him and the crowd, her voice calm and warm. "We do not move away from truth. We move toward it with records and audits," she said. As she spoke, the door to the shed opened, and the elder landlord, so often a symbol of looming eviction, stood there with a weathered smile and a new proposal to lease the space at terms that would allow the foundation to buy it outright within 2 years, a calculated risk that would seal the workshop as a civic nerve center rather than a pawn in a landlord's ledger. The old fear flickered in Tunde's eyes, but the contract's crisp edges reflected back at him the image of a future he could hold on to, and the crowd's clap gathered like rain on zinc roofs, steady and sure. As the afternoon wore on, the second act of the day unfolded with the city's patience turning from rumor to ritual. A smut. All ceremony was organized to publicly thank the neighbors who had fed the hungry and carted away the broken parts of pride. In this moment, the so-called strategic benefactor, the man in work boots who had vanished through the earlier chaos, appeared not as a mysterious shadow, but as a neighbor who had watched from the margins and chosen to walk toward the light. He stepped onto the makeshift dais and spoke in a voice that carried across the yard and into the market's lanes, not to claim ownership, but to acknowledge the foundation and pledge that his company would supply the parts, the tools, and the continuous training needed to keep the buses and the generators running, a practical alliance that transformed the city's gaze from suspicion to shared enterprise. The crowd's reaction was not a single roar, but a layered sound: surprise, relief, a cautious cheer, the quiet tears of a mother who had waited too long for medicine, because the billionaire in disguise had finally become a partner in a more faithful way than the old myths of palace doors could ever permit. Yet the moment kept a thread tense. The benefactor's eyes scanned the crowd, making it clear that the partnership would come with conditions and audits and a living reminder that wealth once hidden would always be under light. Evening settled in like a blanket of velvet over the yard, and the day's last ritual, handing out the first stipends, announcing the first scholarship, and naming 2 young women from the market to sit on the foundation's advisory council, felt less like triumph and more like a new kind of homework. They would learn to run a board, to negotiate with suppliers, to present to the city council without fear, to track every naira with a ledger that could be read by anyone who asked, and to keep their compassion as sharp as a wrench. The old wounds began to close not with fireworks but with routine. The clinic's shelves now stocked, medicines arriving on time, the workshop's benches buzzing with the hum of new machines and the careful chatter of instructors and apprentices. The reverend's chair in the back row of memory lay empty, the church's steeple catching the sun with a clarity that felt like a verdict, and the counselors' posters disappeared from the corridors of Town Hall as if the city itself had chosen to erase the old maps of control. Amaka's online theater of deceit found its echo in a counterpost that exposed the truth with receipts, and the crowd recognized that justice here was not a moment but a practice, a daily act of keeping faith with those who had kept faith with them in the long night. And through it all, Tunde moved with the simple rhythm of a man who had learned to measure wealth by the warmth of a soup shared at dusk, by the price of a child's school fees paid on time, by the line of old women who queued not for charity but for opportunity, by the feel of a wrench made heavy with purpose that he now handed to a new apprentice who would someday hand it back with more knowledge than he had ever imagined. By nightfall, the interval's film had found its new frame, a community that had learned to steward its own light, a foundation that would sustain itself through honest work and transparent numbers, and a city that began to whisper a different vocabulary of power, one that spoke of accountability, of dignity earned together, of wealth that moved like current through wires rather than gaslit walls. Tunde stood at the gate with Mariam beside him, the first class's last bell ringing softly behind them, and the crowd's voices rose again, not to exalt a hero but to promise a shared future, a promise sealed by the sight of apprentices smiling, a mother stepping into the clinic with a supplied bag, a landlord signing the lease with a nod, and a lane now lit by street lamps that would burn longer because someone chose to keep the lights on for more people. The last breath of the day came as a soft wind that carried the market's spices and the diesel tang of engines, and in that air, a final quiet line settled into the ground like seed. Wealth is a river when it learns to give away its banks, and the city's blessing would be measured not by the size of its vault, but by the breadth of the hands it kept open. As the night cooled over the shed and the first class's chatter faded into a hopeful murmur, the SUV that had watched all along rolled away, its engine soft as a memory, leaving behind a future that now belonged to them all. The interval having restarted not with a scream, but with a patient, stubborn, generous demand. Keep building, keep forgiving, keep moving toward a day when no one is left behind, and the shot would cut to the next frame where another class would file in at dawn, another life would be saved by a skill learned, another name would be added to the ledger of those who chose to use wealth to heal, not hoard,